Hello, and thank you for downloading the podcast of Witness History from me, Alex Collins. To mark Pride Month in the US, I'm going to take you back to New York City in 1985 and the opening of a unique high school. I've been speaking to its founder, Steve Ashkenazi.
We were given space by this church where we had allies, the Washington Square Methodist Church. They gave us a room to use, and that's where the school met for the first 3 months.
Steve Ashkenazi had created the high school to support LGBT youth who had been marginalised from the education system in New York and from life. They'd be going to the first school of its kind in America and possibly the world.
It was a very cathartic day because kids got to talk about themselves. They got to meet the teacher. They got to be in an environment with adults who were not looking to exploit them sexually. They got to be in an environment where they were being told that they had potential.
For Steve, setting up the school hadn't been easy. In the early 80s, he was a social worker at an advocacy group supporting the needs of young LGBT people. Steve heard many stories about how teenagers would skip school because they were bullied about their sexuality. Initially, he worked with the Board of Education in New York to see if things could be improved within the mainstream system, but he quickly concluded that some LGBT students needed specialised support at a school of their own. The Board of Education agreed to fund the plan, but the boss at Steve's charity thought it was unworkable.
I got yelled at to such an extent that I really thought I was going to be fired. He just screamed at me and told me I exceeded my boundaries, that we did not have the resources or the ability to do a program like that. And then after all the screaming stopped, I said, "So you want me to tell them that we can't do this?" And he screamed, "No, of course we have to do it now."
So Steve went from social worker to high school principal virtually overnight. He hired his friend Fred Goldhaber as the first teacher. There were 14 boys and 6 girls in the class. They found many of the students through very unconventional means.
We had a team that would go out to gay cruising areas, say 11 p.m. to 4 a.m. in the morning. These were kids who were out in the streets of Greenwich Village and by the piers, places that were very unsafe and places that were known for sex work, and which is how many of these kids were supporting themselves.
Steve felt joyful at creating a safe space for LGBT youth, but the challenges were immense.
We really were, for a long time, a one-room schoolhouse in which not only did we have students from 9th through 12th grade, we also had kids who had learning disabilities. We also had kids who were, on the genius level. And the teacher had to figure out a way to help each of them.
And managing behaviour at the start wasn't always easy. Many of the children they found on the streets had lived very traumatic lives. Steve's skills as a social worker were still needed. He sorted things like therapy and housing out for the kids long after the school day had ended.
My strong belief was when we brought them together, it would be a utopian situation where everybody would get along. And then I was surprised to see that they were constantly insulting and degrading each other, and it totally depressed me. And it took me a while to realize that this is the culture that they came from. Just taking them away from that culture doesn't diminish the lessons that they learn from being in a culture where people degrade each other. And so it did take a while to teach them how to work together.
Steve and the students named their school the Harvey Milk School after the pioneering gay San Francisco mayor. They were keen to get coverage in the press, but this was the mid-1980s, and the media were only interested in covering the emerging AIDS epidemic. Eventually, a prominent New York publication did run a story on the front page, but Steve found it very negative, even incendiary. In the following days, journalists and camera crews camped outside the high school, and Steve remembers having a testy exchange.
I got into a scuffle with the reporter and the cameraman. I knocked the camera out of his hands, off his shoulder, and it fell to the ground. I heard a big crash. I don't know if I broke it or what, but I screamed at the reporter. Is this what they taught you in journalism school, to run after children and scare them? Somehow he got that message and he backed off because I thought I was going to get punched in the face.
Do you have any regrets about doing that?
What I was trying to do was come between this reporter and this cameraman and this kid and send this kid on his way and block them from following him. And that turned into a scuffle. I don't regret it. It happened in the course of something that I needed to do, which is protecting this kid.
Steve was always protective of his students. The nurturing environment he created turned some of the former dropouts into academic high achievers and even college graduates. But one of the students Steve remembers most was called Kevin. Steve supported him after he got in trouble for attending one of the voguing balls, which became part of Black and Latino LGBT culture in the 1980s.
Kevin went to one of those balls and he actually won a trophy. However, because he stayed out late that night and missed curfew at home, his parents threw him out of the house and he was homeless. He was confident that he had friends and he would do some couch surfing and that he would be okay for a while. But he asked me to hold on to his belongings. 2 weeks later, I received notification that he had been murdered. My assumption it was while hustling. I was stuck holding on to his belongings and I went through it and it really amounted to some clothing and a few books and one trophy. The trophy was very nice. I kept it. I put it in storage. But a few years ago, I did come across this trophy and it reminded me of, poor Kevin. And so I now have that trophy sitting on my mantle.
In the next few years, the Harvey Milk School expanded from its single classroom. It still exists today, with 60 students currently enrolled. Similar initiatives have also been introduced in 3 other US states, although not always successfully. But Steve remains convinced that some LGBT students need a specialised environment.
What we had to demonstrate then and still is that a certain student could not function well in a homophobic environment and that they needed the extra support services to help them to succeed at school. If they had other issues going on about self-acceptance, about being able to avoid bullying, then they needed to be in a special environment. And that still happens today.
Steve was principal for 7 years, leaving in the 90s to set up a homeless shelter for LGBT youth. Looking back, he's proud of what the Harvey Milk High School students achieved.
A lot of them had very, very little self-worth. They really thought that they could never succeed except through their sex work. They didn't believe that they could learn or ever have a legitimate job or even a career. And I think that we did a good job in succeeding in making them believe that they could achieve anything that they wanted to, including things that they never even dreamed about.
Steve Ashkenazi was speaking to me, Alex Collins, for that edition of Witness History. We have a collection of more stories from LGBT history online. Just search for Witness History LGBT Collection. Thank you for listening and goodbye.